Welcome to this explainer. Okay, we're diving straight into a fascinating concept today. Why complex organizations, no matter what kind they are, tend to freeze up in exactly the same way. Whether we're talking about biology, technology, or human institutions, there's this universal architecture to how systems are built, and honestly, more importantly, exactly how they fail.
I mean, have you ever wondered why a frozen computer giving you the spinning wheel of death, an unresponsive government bureaucracy, and a viral infection are structurally identical? I know, it sounds like a massive stretch, right? But the source material we're looking at today maps out a unified theory. It shows that these failures aren't just similar, they're literally the exact same mechanical breakdown, just happening in completely different domains.
So, it all comes down to this concept called governance oversaturation. Basically, this is a state where the rule enforcement layer, that meta layer governing the system, gets heavier than the actual functional layer doing the real work. The system just accumulates so many interlocking permissions, checks, and oversight mechanisms that it completely disconnects from operational reality. It can't receive, process, or act on real feedback anymore. It literally goes deaf to the outside world.
Part 1. When systems stop listening. Let's look at how this builds, starting with something you're probably very familiar with, your computer.
In operating systems, when that governance layer gets too dense, it triggers what software engineers call feedback breakage. Real signals, like your mouse clicks or error logs, just can't make it through this massive thicket of security layers and policy daemons, which, are basically just those invisible background tasks enforcing the rules. Because it can't get external input, the system starts to hallucinate its own reality. It enforces totally outdated rules, maybe thinking a process is running when it's actually dead, or assuming a resource is free when it's locked up tight. It stops doing actual work and spends all its energy just managing its own internal rulebook.
Engineers call this a control plane collapse. It's a total deadlock where the system becomes purely self-referential. In OS terms, you might hear it called thrashing. You've definitely experienced this. You hear your laptop fan spinning wildly. It's working as hard as it possibly can, but the screen is completely frozen. That computer is exhausting all of its processing power on oversight and recovery routines, with zero actual output to show for it. It's governing itself, not the world.
Part 2. Democracy versus the administrative state. Now, what's truly fascinating is how perfectly this computing concept maps onto human societies.
Just look at the direct equivalence here. In a computer, the kernel handles core operations. In a state, that's your direct public services, things like police, courts, and health networks. But look at the governance layer. In an OS, you have permission systems and schedulers. In a government, this acts exactly like the permanent administrative state. We're talking regulatory commissions, compliance divisions, rulemaking bodies. These institutions are the state's control plane. They don't deliver services directly, right? They govern the government itself.
Because of this structure, it is absolutely crucial to separate democracy from governance. Democracy acts as the input layer. The people's vote is essentially the user input that selects leaders and provides legitimacy. But democracy doesn't directly run the machinery. The governance layer, that administrative state we just talked about, is the control layer. It interprets the rules, filters the signals, and manages the actual day-to-day operations. They're completely different systems.
So, what actually happens when that administrative control layer gets oversaturated? Well, you get democracy. This is a systemic condition where the control layer stops receiving the public signal entirely. Elections still happen, votes are still counted, and legitimacy is still claimed at that input layer. But the governance machinery becomes what researchers call autopoietic, meaning it's entirely self-creating and self-referential. It behaves independently, resistant to feedback, completely insulated from democratic input. Just like that frozen computer we talked about, it completely stops listening to the user.
Part 3. The biology of bureaucracy. And here is where it gets crazy. This exact same structural failure happens inside you.
Meet allosteric modulation. In biochemistry, this is a reactive mechanism where a third molecule binds to a protein and changes how that protein interprets its primary signal. It doesn't create anything new, it just intercepts and alters the response. It creates a third meaning. Think of it like a translator who suddenly decides to change the tone of your words. And this is exactly how a bureaucracy modulates laws. The public's vote is the primary signal, but the administrative state is the allosteric modulator that binds to it and distorts or changes how that signal is actually executed into policy.
Following this biological mapping, an infection acts as a biological governance override. It hijacks resources and forces emergency protocols, exactly like a rogue administrative state.
An infection clogs your bodily system and drains resources, just like bureaucratic oversaturation. And your immune response? Well, that's internal counter-governance, like an inspector general trying to restore integrity. A fever is an emergency protocol suspending normal operations. And a viral takeover is quite literally a coup that hijacks your body's control layer to serve a totally new regime.
Part 4. The generative development sequence. Now, to really grasp why these reactive modulators break systems so profoundly, we first need to understand the baseline architecture of how healthy systems actually build things in the first place.
The baseline for building anything, whether it's an idea, a biological cell, or a whole nation, follows this really beautiful, straightforward sequence. Concept to conception to execution. This is the foundational pathway of creation. It's a developmental arc that builds something entirely new. Think of photosynthesis, or identity formation, or drafting a constitution. It is a constructive, step-by-step realization of an idea.
However, these generative processes, they don't exist in a vacuum. They build reality, sure, but they are constantly surrounded and influenced by reactive modulators that alter their path. These modulators don't build anything themselves. They're instantaneous, interpretive, and regulatory. They bind to the generative process and change its rate, its direction, or its overall meaning. Part 5. The Unified Systems Architecture. Let's pull this all together and map how these modulators behave identically across every domain of life.
This brilliantly illustrates the unified architecture. Just look at how these modulators function across totally different spheres. In psychology, play acts as a temporal modulator, altering our perception of time and opening up creativity. Meanwhile, in media, mediation, like framing, tone, or even the fonts used, modulates the narrative and meaning of a signal. In the state, governance modulates permissions and information flow, and in biology, infection modulates your physiological state. They all sit right above the generative sequence, changing the output without ever replacing the original input.
So while the generative pathway executes the raw work, like a CPU crunching code, a plant building energy, or the people casting a vote, the reactive modulators act as the ultimate control plane. They decide how that work is actually experienced or interpreted. The OS scheduler, our shifting human emotions, and the administrative state all sit right there in that modulatory layer, constantly adjusting the dials of the system.
Which brings us to the real root of the collapse, our most profound insight today. Complex systems fail because their rulemakers stop trusting the feedback from the real world. Governance saturation isn't just a byproduct of having too many rules. It's what happens when a system compensates for a lack of trust in reality by just adding endless performative checks, fallback routines, and monitoring tasks. Each new layer of governance reduces the system's ability to hear the real world until it finally, inevitably collapses under the weight of its own attempt to control itself.
So I'm going to leave you with this to evaluate. When you look at the systems in your own life, the software you use, the organizations you work for, the governments that represent you, which ones are operating generatively, and which have entirely stopped listening to reality? It's a pretty powerful lens for understanding the world, isn't it? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and we'll catch you next time.